Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now over the last couple of weeks we've been making a few Linux based videos, and today I want to talk about Linux versus Windows with older games. Now I use a fairly modern system, one that features an RX 9060 XT, and while I play a lot of modern games mainly for testing, it's really older titles that I sit down with in my personal time to play through. Now these can have their fair share of issues with modern hardware, and we may need to implement a few tweaks in order to get them to run smoothly. Games like GTA 4 come to mind that will run quite poorly with their native DX9 API, but with a few tweaks, well, they can certainly be smoothed out. We're focusing on out-of-the-box performance today, though, Windows versus Linux across a selection of my favourite older titles to see how the two compare. I'm using Windows 11 24H2 with my 9060 XT 16GB, and for the Linux side of things we're using Nobara 42. So let's get into it. I'm losing my voice, I've got a bit of a cold I think, but hopefully it lasts for the duration of this video. Now, as I mentioned earlier, running certain older titles out of the box, so to speak, with Windows can occasionally be problematic, especially with modern hardware. That's something I found anyway when trying to play a few of my favourites. So is it any better with the out-of-the-box Linux experience without any tweaks with Windows or Linux today? How do things compare? So to start with, we have one of my all-time favourites. This is the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, of course. As you can see here, all gameplay was captured from within Linux today. I'm using Mango HUD to show you the on-screen stats, and I'm using something called GPU Screen Recorder in order to capture the footage, which works really well in Linux here. I've been having a great time using this. So we are recording everything internally. I still haven't got around to replacing my capture card, but there doesn't seem to be much of any performance loss when using this with this hardware configuration, which is made up of an i9 4900K and of course a 16GB 9060 XT. So in terms of performance here with Nobara 42, we're getting 208 FPS on average with a 1% low of 143. This is a little less than in Windows 11, where we saw 241 as the average and 199 as that 1% low. So starting off then, and we have a better result for Windows 11. But don't get used to this, that's all I'm going to say. Next up we have Fallout New Vegas, which I featured in a short yesterday because I was quite surprised at how well this ran under Linux. A lot better than it does with Windows 11, that's for sure. Not to mention I didn't get any crashing during my about an hour gameplay session today. It was just a benchmark to start with, but as usual with Fallout I got carried away and then played the game for a while. So in Linux here under Nobara 42, we're getting 143 FPS with a 1% low of 94. So it's a pretty smooth, consistent experience at 1440p with the highest settings. When we compare this to Windows, we saw just 97 FPS with a 1% low of 35. Now 97 is still a pretty good average frame rate. You'd think it would be higher considering this is an older game, and I'd certainly recommend a 60 FPS cap for the physics related issues with this one, but the consistency was all over the place too under Windows 11. 35 was that 1% low. The legendary GTA 4 is up next. Now with Linux here we're seeing 178 FPS with a 1% low of 127. This is running with DXVK by default here. I didn't do anything, I didn't have to tweak anything. This is just how it ran straight out of the box. We can of course use DXVK in Windows as well to improve things, not just in this game but others as well. When we compare these figures to Windows, well, it's a pretty decent improvement. So 178 and 127 for the average and 1% lows under Linux. And when we look at the Windows 11 result, we're seeing 99 and 48. So yeah, it's pretty clear that there are a few problems here and there when running GTA 4 under Windows 11. I still love playing a bit of GTA 4, it's one of my go-to games even in 2025, when I just want to sit down and have some fun. Now when it came to Half-Life 2, I had to remember to disable the frame rate cap. At first it was 290 FPS under Linux and I thought, that's a little low, but then when I entered the command FPS_max 0, the frame rate quickly shot up and we saw over 500 FPS on average, 540 with a 1% low of 397. There were a couple of issues. To start with, well, one issue really, and that was with the lighting. Instead of some textures in certain places, we were getting just black squares, and I fixed this by changing one of the lighting options to high instead of very high. So I did the same for Windows as well, where we saw 526, so slightly less in terms of that average. And when it comes to the 1% low figure, we saw 395 compared to 397, so we lost 2 FPS under Windows 11. Now I wanted to try Rage because this was one of my favourite games back in the day, and it's a pretty interesting one from a technical standpoint. It is capped at 60 FPS, so this is more of a test of consistency, but this one used something called mega texturing, which basically streamed the textures in as and when it needed them, so it ran really well on a wide range of hardware, whether it was Intel HD graphics or a modern day graphics card like the 9060 XT, but when you get up close to things, yeah, it doesn't look all that sharp, but it does give the game a unique visual aesthetic. Of course, it runs at 60 FPS under Linux with the 9060 XT, hitting the frame rate cap here with a 1% low of 55, and the performance was basically identical under Windows, 60 as that average and 55 as that 1% low. I think it used like a terabyte of uncompressed textures, something like that, and then it just sort of streamed them in as and when it needed them. I can't quite remember what it was from a technical standpoint, but I did make a whole video on it back in the day, testing it with various hardware. Next up we have Tomb Raider, the original 2013 game here. Now this will use DX11 by default under Windows. With Linux here it is of course using DXVK and running at 167 FPS with a 1% low of 125. This wasn't too different from the Windows result, which saw 161 and 125, so pretty much the same, to be honest. Not a difference that you're going to feel unless you have an FPS overlay enabled like I do here. I think it still holds up pretty well visually for a game that's over 10 years old now, and still one that's well worth playing, to be honest. Now in order to get this one to run, I did have to force the use of a specific compatibility tool under the compatibility tab, in this case the Proton hotfix, because it would just open and then close again. Next up we have Mafia II. This is a game that I used to play lots and lots back in the day on my PlayStation 3, I believe it was. There was a whole controversy because I think the PS3 version didn't have grass in certain areas where the Xbox 360 version did. Now with Linux, the game runs at 1440p of course with the high settings at 269 FPS with a 1% low of 211, so very consistent and very smooth indeed. The average frame rate isn't too different on Windows, 266, but that 1% low drops to 60 here, so it is far less consistent overall, and Linux is going to offer a far smoother experience with this title from 2010, I believe it was. Still one of my favourites, to be honest. I used to play this for hours. Mafia 3 wasn't as memorable in my opinion, but it did have a killer soundtrack, so there is that. Now I wanted to try Crysis as my last game, but I could not get the FPS overlay to work, and when I tried to run the in-game benchmark with an overlay from just a console command to try and gauge an average, it ran really slow at like 4 FPS. When I was actually playing it ran really well, but when I came to benchmark it, it ran like a PowerPoint presentation. Instead I swapped this out for the original Far Cry, which I think is a fantastic game, to be honest, even a couple of decades later. Well worth a play. It runs on pretty much anything these days. Here with Linux, 283 FPS with a 1% low of 221, compared to Windows, which saw 288, so slightly better, about 5 FPS more so, and an improvement of about 10 FPS for that 1% figure. But there we go, Windows versus Linux in a selection of my favourite older titles. We did do a brief comparison with a few newer games not so long ago, and that's something I want to expand on very soon, but hopefully you've enjoyed seeing how Linux compares to Windows with a selection of classic games. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, let me know your thoughts down below, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.